And going back to the olden days of Sierra Audio, they were one of the first companies, if not the first, to really bank on people owning music cards, because music cards were considered a luxury in the late 80s.
I mean, I don't think we had one in our household until possibly the mid-90s.
Oh yeah.
So
and before, I mean, just to preempt, if people are watching this who are unaware, I'm assuming most people who are watching this video are like 30 plus or something, but just to preempt, we called them music cards in the late 80s when I was just a child. We didn't call them sound cards because they couldn't reproduce digital audio. They couldn't. They only had FM synthesis in it, the ad-lib cards and the Tandy 3 voice and stuff like that. Sound Blaster wasn't introduced until the early 90s.
Yeah, 91 in Sierra world. So the Sierra context would be in the install.exe program or the resource.cfg file for those savvy fans. You would see the difference between simply a music option and a music and audio option. And I think for a small while in the crossover, there was an option for music that you could select MT32 with Sound Blaster. I was an adult the first time I heard Roger say, "Where am I?" I
was so blown away when I heard, yeah, me too. And that was the Amiga version. I thought for the longest time it was only the Amiga version that got all the digital sound effects. Praise be. So you've been giving me a lot of pats on the back for knowing stuff about Space Quest, but honestly, you know everything there is to know. When your name is the
Space Quest historian.
Arrogantly so. But you, without giving yourself an arrogant nickname, actually, as you say, have talked to every Sierra composer. Played pretty much every Sierra game, and you've studied the music intensely.
I played all the popular ones other than a couple of the very final versions. Like, I still, to my shame, haven't played King's Quest 8, Quest for Glory 5, and the CD version later, Gabriel Knights. So those are games that I still need to play. But other than those, I've played every core Sierra game you can imagin.
And studied the music for recording purposes. But what made you
well versed in all their music?
What made you latch onto the music specifically?
That's a really good question. As you would appreciate, it's hard to remember some of those triggers from our formative years, as it were, our teen years, especially as weird children as both you and I were. In those...
Squid monster. Yes. Oh, not that kind of trigger. Sorry. Yeah, that's the PTSD talking.
For anybody who doesn't get that was from part of our cut pre-interview conversations.
Yeah, so we were both scared shitless of the squid in Space Quest 2.
We didn't like the squid monster in Space Quest 2. He frightened us.
Yes, he did.
But yeah, at some point, I enjoyed. I think what it was, and I could be wrong even in my own internal memory here, but I think I enjoyed what Quest Studios did, and at the time they didn't have any soundtracks public. Because web hosting was a problem back in the early 2000s. Seems funny now with Google Drive and all that sort of thing. But back in 2002, when I started to really get into online Sierra community, hosting 100 megs was a problem. And at the time, Quest Studios had none of their soundtracks online, only MIDIs online, although digital soundtracks would go on in the next few years. And even when they did, a lot of soundtracks were absent. So,
Oh, it's worth mentioning. This is pre-Spotify, Bandcamp, whatever you have. These online services that actually can do the things now that we really wanted back in 2002.
Even now, there are apps and programs that allow web hosting to play MIDI files and other things, all of which did not exist.
Oh, that sounds awesome.
Or did not exist in any useful fashion, borderline 20 years ago. So yeah, I guess I took it on myself to try and learn that. What I had no idea of as a teenage boy, however, was that I would spend the next sort of 5 years of my life, or 6 to 12 months of my life, let's say, simply learning basics, because MIDI, for all that I'll defend it as a platform, is an incredibly intricate format. So to learn the ins and outs, and not only the ins and outs, but also the ins and outs of what Sierra did, which for anybody who's ever been through more than about 10 Sierra MIDI files of the original game data will know that they did some weird things and some non-standard things, which we'll get to later with Trolls talking about pitch bend, as he hinted at, which is an absolute doozy. It took me almost 10 years to fully understand what they'd done. But yeah, so the point is, I had to learn MIDI. I had to learn Sierra's game MIDI. I had to learn the odd things that Sierra did. I had to learn recording MIDI. I mean, obviously, again, in 2020, you got DOSBox. It has a record MIDI function. How easy can you get? Press a button and it records the MIDI, and you stop when you want it to stop. That's not how recording MIDI was in 2002. If you have a MIDI device like a Roland MT32, you had to have a sound card, for example, a Sound Blaster. And you had to have an antiquated piece of equipment called a joystick to MIDI cable, which plugged into the giant joystick port on your sound card.
Remember those?
Then the other side of that, what?
Oh, I was just winking at the camera, going, "Remember those?" No one does.
Yeah. No, I haven't seen one in a very long time because they are obsolete. But the other side is a MIDI in and MIDI out plug. So those would plug into your synthesizer. One basically sends MIDI data from the computer to the synthesizer. The other direction sends it from the synthesizer to the computer. And then you would record the MIDI return, basically.
Yes.
But yeah, the bottom line was, because recording MIDI like that was A, a huge pain in the butt, and B, would be inaccurate. MIDI recording on an old piece of hardware, on this case my 1995 computer that I was using in the early 2000s, the timing was off. And you'll see it in some of Quest Studio's MIDI recordings at times as well. There'll be a little pause where there shouldn't be, or if you open it in a MIDI editor, the timing just isn't rounded correctly. Point being that it was hard to do, and it was technical to do, and something Sierra gamers will appreciate. Recording through games that have timer bugs pre-DOSBox meant you had to record the music while the timer bug is happening. So that was a nightmare. Sierra's intros often cut the music off. For example, Space Quest V never plays the full intro track in game,
and there's no way to pause it.
Amazingly slow computer.
Yes, there's a bunch of stuff in Space Quest V that never plays all the way through because it gets cut off by something else happening.
Speaking of New Rising Sun and drivers, the Space Quest V driver stops some unique SC55 drum kits from being used.
Why?
Well, it shouldn't have been put in there anyway, because Sierra and Dynamics agreed that they wouldn't do any SC55 specific or GS specific messages, so that people with non-Rolands, would hear the same. Well, it would actually work on both devices. But yeah, I think it's just a driver being broken issue. I don't think it was an intentional issue of any kind. But for whatever reason, the drum kit changes that are present in Space Quest V, for example, Captain Quirks theme, which plays only about 1 million times in the game. I think it plays 6 times or 7 times in the game, but it's a lot.
Every time he shows up, really.
every time good old Captain Quirk shows up. Well, the big irony is, for all the work Sierra did on conversions, as we touched on earlier, one thing they did not put effort into, at least with any real effort, Dynamics did a little bit, but on Sierra's part, they put almost no effort into MT32 conversions, because after the initial games of General MIDI, which were, again, King's Quest VI, Quest for Glory 3, which were also decent budget games too, I guess, some of the other games that followed, and even big games, had bare minimum MT32 support and not translated over for that synth. So, yeah, the quality is pretty high.
When we get to the
Sierra actually made a really bad mistake too, which I don't know why, but the custom patches they sent for General MIDI, and again, Dynamics did not have this problem, but some of the patches aren't translated properly. So there's an infamous example in Quest for Glory 4 where you meet the fun forest creature, the Lishi, And because Sierra thought that no one would ever use a viola in General Midi's patches and would always use violin, the MT32 translates viola, the one time it's used, which is this time in Quest for Glory 4, at least to my knowledge, translates it to a door slam sound effect. So if you play the Lishi on an MT32, depending how the game is feeling, it will either spit out the General MIDI patch viola and give you a door slam on the MT32, or it will try to correct it with a strings patch. But because of the buggy driver, again, Sierra and their drivers, you may hear a string sound or you may hear a door slam sound.
Well, ripping MIDI is no longer necessary because now we have lovely things like Sci Companion that can just open these games up and you can just dump all the freaking MIDI data from them. Not an option in 2002 either.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Or if you're good friends with New Rising Sun like I am, there are special programs that can extract all the assets from the games bit perfectly, which is very, very nice, let me tell you.
Yeah, he actually did write because MIDI data in Sierra files had the extension SND. It was a proprietary format that Sierra had. And New Rising Sun somehow wrote a program that converted SNDs to MIDI files.
Well, he has, from my understanding, and this could be wrong, but I know that I know factually that he does have some of the original programs that Sierra used, because something that he's helped him with, just very quick tangent for fun, is a program that allows you to convert MIDI back to SND. And that has uses for tempo of MIDI files, because old school recorded versions like Quest Studios and my ancient recordings would have a tempo of 100 beats per minute, whereas anything extracted from a Sierra game generally has 120, and then the master files from the composers themselves has the actual tempo it was recorded at, which could be anything.
And this is an interesting tangent.
Of course, just quickly, I'll finish because otherwise I'll forget where I was at. If you want to, for those who don't work with MIDI, which is probably everyone watching this, you cannot copy and paste bits of MIDI data from one tempo to another. It will be too fast or too slow. So the software meaning that I can convert anything to Sierra's internal tempo of 120 means I can now interface ancient Quest Studios or my recordings, Sierra in-game extracted data, and Sierra Composer's master data. So that it was just a huge thing to be able to do. Anyway.
The MIDI data that I got out from Sci Companion and a lovely fellow on my SQH Discord named Kigurame ripped some MIDI data that I was unable to convert for most of those vinyl projects that I've done. And those all came with no tempo. They all import at 120 BPM. And what I would do is, for some reason in my digital audio workstation, you can select all of the MIDI data and choose an option that says just ignore whatever BPM I set this track or this project to, and then I would just sort of sit there and listen with the metronome and go, that's 115, no, that's 114, no, that's 113, and just lock out sometimes. And I got pretty good at guessing BPMs after doing Space
Quest. That's pretty impressive.
I had to do that.
I'm good at common BPMs. Like 100, 110, 120, things that a lot of video games use.
You can sort of tell.
The composers often, and especially, and when you hear something at the wrong tempo too, and you know what the correct tempo sounds like, at least in your head or from having played it in game, you can kind of either do the math or just kind of guess. It's about 1.5 times too fast sort of thing.
Yeah. But the MIDIs would import in the correct tempo, but the project would be set at 120, and then you just sort of have to guess. And it was only an issue because what I do with the reorchestrations things is just import the MIDI data and then pick new sound patches for whatever comes in, and then sort of sit and fiddle with, I'll double this. This used to be a flute, but I'll double it so there's also a clarinet playing it and stuff like that. But never changing the original MIDI data, except for transposing it an octave up or down depending on if the patch is being weird.
Some MT, just to explain for those watching at home again, some MT32 patches especially, and some general MIDI, but especially the MT32 would play at different octaves for some instruments, especially basses.
Especially, so, the acoustic bass and the timpani, for some reason, always come in an octave lower. So I would do that, and then usually you don't need the metronome for any of that because you're just picking new stuff out and you're not changing the MIDI data. But every once in a while, you want to get fancy. You want to have like an arpeggiator bubbling away in the background. And if that's not in the correct tempo, then chaos ensues.
Geez, I didn't even think about that because I don't really use ARP instruments, although I have some on some of the more modern synths. But yeah, I've never even thought to try to use that. Yeah, I'll have to talk to you about that separately sometime. Because if you try to use an ARP synth just normally, it sounds completely messed up to play a line. You know what I mean? Because it does its own thing.
Yeah.
Versus just playing original melody. But I can see that there will be times where you would absolutely want that, or it will be fun to do. But yeah, I'm not really adventurous enough to use synth patches like that. Although I have a lot of them.
It's tricky, isn't it? I think because I'm working with Space Quest music, and especially Space Quest 4, which it's like half orchestral but also half synthy. So I can get away with using some slightly esoteric.
50-50.
Yeah. Some of it's synth.
I mean, Space Quest 1, 3, 5, and 4. Yeah, I mean, all of the Space Quest MIDI soundtracks all have quite a lot of synth sounds in them.
Yeah. Space Quest 3 especially, which is basically just synth rock. Almost has no orchestral music in it, except for the garbage freight, like when the garbage freighter pulls you up, maybe. So I had a lot of fun with that, and there's a lot of arpeggiators in my reorchestrations.
Well, Space Quest 3 just makes sense because A, there's not a lot of music, and B, a lot of it is more on the ambient side with the only real sort of genuine soundtrack music is sort of at the start and end, like the intro and finale.
Yeah.
During the actual gameplay, like there isn't hardly any music at all. It's mostly set. Well, if you have an MT32, you'll hear a lot of sound effects. Like if you listen, a good example is listening to the Quest Studios recorded MIDI soundtrack because they include some sound effect tracks which aren't really listenable in later Sierra games, but in the early Sierra games, like it's real movie quality stuff that they were able to do. And Space Quest 3 is a really, really good example of some amazing sounds that people think of later on as Sound Blaster effects sort of stuff. But early on, it was done on the MT32, and some of the effects on the what's the shredding thing called on the garbage freighter?
Oh, the thing that when you fall into it, it goes.
Yeah.
I don't
There's
know
a name
what
for it. I can't remember.
Well, it's a shreddy thingy conveyor.
Yeah. But some of the effects are around that part, and just on the garbage scow in general, and actually on the Planet of Fleabud as well, like all the wind effects and thunder and stuff. You would, if you hear the thunder in Space Quest 3 on an MT32, like when you get lightning struck, for example, it'll make you jump. Like
it's
and
loud.
on Ortega, like
all the bubbly,
all the sounds are so amazing.
Yeah.
Like the MT32, if you want to know a game to start with the MT32, just to get an idea of what it can do other than basic music, which you've heard before, Space Quest 3 is the game to start with.
Yeah, they did.
Or Space Quest 1 VGA for a similar reason.
I think Mark Siebert did most of those sound effects-y ambient type stuff, and then Bob Siebenberg did.
I would imagine he did, because from my understanding with Mark Siebert, with other sort of big name composers, obviously, for those who don't know, Bob Siebenberg, who did Space Quest 3's music, was the drummer in the famous band Supertramp from the 70s and 80s. And yeah, obviously Bob wouldn't have been sitting at an MT32 programming sound effects. So Mark or someone else would have been doing that. Probably, I think Mark on that particular project.
Yeah, it was Mark.
The only special versions of Space Quest 6 is the trailer version, which I don't know if I told you about, but I found it recently, only in the last 12 or so months. and has the non-final voice actors voicing the introduction.